You all know what that sound means. We're back at it again for another teaching session. Actually, not a teaching session. Well, we're teaching you.
Yeah. Team teaching session.
Team teaching session.
So a traditional episode.
Yes, a regular business as usual episode. The man correcting me over there, that guy is the John Adams to my Thomas Jefferson. He is the Ben Franklin to my any nameless French prostitutes. That's Professor Adam. I'm Professor Chris. And today we are bringing you the story of the birth of America.
Yeah, I mean, it's our revolution. It's the revolution for the country and everybody outside the world. You're probably going to be shocked by the neutrality that we take to this episode, but this is how America, the United States, became America, the United States.
It's a field of gray. There are not good guys here. There are not bad guys. There's simply different perspectives to this. The educational system in the United States, I don't think I've really looked into this topic since high school.
No.
And when you learn about it, you learn one very specific side of it. You learn one very specific theme of the underdog overcoming all odds to gain their independence. And essentially this starts out as a civil war, and then through that civil war morphs into a revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the revolution is almost, from everything that I've learned as a kid, and it takes a lot for me to feel like actual anger during these episodes. I think I texted you about it. When we do Nazi episodes, I get a little angry about it. It makes me a little sad. I didn't expect to get angry about this, but I think it's partially just because the story of the revolution, maybe I just wasn't great at paying attention and listening, but I feel like I would know this stuff. The story of the revolution that's told in the United States and the story of the revolution that's told in Great Britain, I think it's called like the Americans Fight for Freedom or some shit like that in Great Britain. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, and it lies much closer to the center of those two stories than I had thought starting this whole thing.
Yeah, we're provided a very specific version of this that provides a very clear-cut good guy, very clear-cut bad guy, very simple reasons why this occurred when in actuality this is not a simple topic at all. It's very complex, and there's so many things that we don't know about this, just learning it through our schooling system, that I hope the rest of the world actually knows a little bit more about this topic than we did.
Yeah, Mel Gibson just keeps ruining these things. We keep having to go back and clean up Mel Gibson's. We're going to have to clean up Apocalypto. We had to clean up Braveheart. We're going to have to clean up The Patriot during this one. Everything that he does, we just have to come through and correct.
God damn it, I didn't even think about that.
We're chasing him.
Right. That's right. All right, guys. Well, we're not going to keep you waiting any longer. One thing you can do, if you want to go ahead and support the podcast, keep helping us out. Those reviews and those 5 stars are doing fantastic.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Follow us anywhere you get your podcasts, and keep coming with the feedback, guys. It keeps us motivated, and we'll keep doing this as long as you keep listening.
All right. Let's fire the first shot.
So I want to lay some groundwork here, because one of the misconceptions that I had about this was the number of people in the colonies at the time that this kind of all popped off. I thought it was way less than there actually were. And I guess I didn't understand kind of the length of time that had occurred between the first founding of the Jamestown colony, which was the first time colonists from Britain came over and established a permanent colony, which was Jamestown, Virginia, 1607.
James the Sixth? Is that who was named after from the Scotland episode?
I can't.
One of the 15 Jameses that they had?
It definitely wasn't John.
No, it wasn't Johnstown.
No. 1620, this is when the Pilgrims actually came over and established the second colony in Massachusetts. Now you got people in Virginia and Massachusetts. I love pointing this out too, because you asked a question last night and I gave an answer. Between 1610, so like literally 3 years after the Brits came over here, and April 1775, which is when the revolution kind of gets kicked off, an estimated 50 to 120,000 British convicts were shipped over to the colonies. So
Yep.
in kind of the same way that Australia, well, essentially we weren't founded as a penal colony, but as soon as we were founded, we started being used as a penal colony.
They wanted to get that sweet penal blood over here for some reason.
Get it out of England. 1632, this is when Maryland and Virginia, what they consider like the Chesapeake colonies, this is when Maryland was actually founded. 1663, that's when you get the Carolinas, and 1732, that's when you get Georgia. During this time as well, you're getting like Maine, you're getting New York, Pennsylvania, to establish what are going to be known as the 13 original colonies.
And another misconception that I had about this whole entire thing, there weren't just 13 colonies in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, there was just 13 within that continent.
Well, there were still some settlements up in Canada, but as far as like United States proper, it was just the 13. You also had the entire region in the Caribbean where they had these islands. I believe Cuba was one. I don't remember which one.
So you got like Cuba, you have like the Bahamas, Nassau, you would have Haiti, Dominican Republic, whatever that was called initially. I can't remember the original name. We discussed that during the
Saint Domingue.
Yeah, like
That was the French colony.
Yes.
But regardless, Britain had holdings down there, and just like France was using Saint Domingue for all the sugar, so was Great Britain. They were growing all of the sugar cane down there, and as far as exports go, the 13 colonies' best export that they had that Britain wanted the most was tobacco.
And rum. Apparently up in like Boston and New England, like 80% of the sugar that went up there was used to make rum.
That came from the islands.
The Caribbean.
So when you have something like the Caribbean over there that's so much more of a moneymaker, I was always under the assumption that when the 13 colonies fell during the Revolutionary War, it kind of shook Britain a little bit. But they didn't lose their highest prized jewel in the crown that was over in the Western Hemisphere, because all of those sugar islands down there still made a lot of money.
Technically, it led to why they capitulated. That was a huge factor. And it'll all make sense when we kind of get into it. By 1775, there were 2.5 million colonists in the 13 colonies. Now, 500,000 of those were slaves. And I was just kind of trying to factor in doing the math of finding out how long people had been there to establish and become like, if you could be third generation, colonial American or whatever you would call it. That equals about 5 generations since Jamestown was founded. I think they consider a generation between 20 and 30 years.
Yeah,
so you
probably,
had people that were very easily born in America, had known nothing but being in the American colonies, and already there, yeah, you're under British rule at that point, but just being born in a different place where you have different things influencing you, you're, the people making your rules are 2,000 miles, whatever it is, the Atlantic Ocean away. After 5 generations, I mean, you're going to start to kind of split, not only in, we had a debate about the accent thing, not only in the way that you talk over the course of those generations, but just also in kind of what your belief is and how you should be governed.
I truly hope that the Chesapeake Bay area, that Maryland area over there, had that accent that they do now early, because it's my favorite accent.
Like the Baltimore accent?
Yeah, Baltimore accents are the best. Can you imagine them trying to speak like proper British English with that accent? Can you imagine
how terrifying that had to be for the British troops that were over here just getting yelled at insults in that accent? It would sound like a fucking Ravens game.
Yeah, it probably would. A Ravens game in 1665.
Which, Raiders just beat the Ravens.
Oh.
One thing that had happened kind of leading up to the American Revolution is there was this thing over in Europe that was called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, after kind of just even scratching the surface on it, is on the list of episodes that we're going to do. But what this basically was is the Enlightenment was a shift from theology to almost a moral philosophy. Science started to rise as scientific research started to provide explanations for things that religious had just not either they weren't able to provide the answers to, or they just said, well, it's because God made it that way. You also had this big rise in the belief of being, consent of the governed. You were only in a position of government because the people that you're governing allow you to be.
a democratic approach is to the difference of what's going on now.
Correct. It's wording that's within our Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. A big thing about the Enlightenment was also the rise in equality. So you're starting to get these, and also listen,
To a certain
equality
extent.
within certain groups, yes, but it's still equality nonetheless. And then also religious tolerance, which was something very new because you had all these completely established religions that you had, like the big one, the Catholic Church and everything, but you also had places like France that were still, hey, you better be this certain religion or you're not going to be here. So this Enlightenment ends up coming over and hitting the colonies as early as like 1688. It had happened 50 to 100 years previous in Europe, and then finally, through word of mouth and things coming over, it kind of made its way over to the colonies.
You can imagine, too, it probably empowered some of the colonists up in New England because their families came over as Puritans. Their families came over looking for religious freedom away from the Church of England.
Yeah.
And so once the Enlightenment reaches over there and they start hearing that there's religious tolerance that they believe is going on back in England, which is still an air quotes religious tolerance because Enlightenment didn't take hold into the government or anything like that. It was just kind of a movement among the people. But it almost justifies their reasons for coming over to the New World as Puritans because that was kind of their idea first, even though religious tolerance over here was still kind of like religious tolerance over there.
Oh, now you guys want religious tolerance in Europe. After 300 years, we've already moved over here.
We had to move to a new landmass so you guys could come up with this late.
Now, the structure of government at the time prior to the Revolutionary War in the colonies was essentially you had the colonies themselves kind of being their own independent little things. This wasn't anything united. This wasn't United States. It was separate colonies that were all run by like a governor. They all had their own type of like legislature to make the rules that were specific within their colonies. There was intercolonial commerce and trade and all that kind of stuff because those people are your neighbors. But
between the colonies close to you.
correct.
And when you start to get down into like the Carolinas in Georgia, they actually trade and do things more with the Caribbean colonies. And Chesapeake Bay area, New England, they all kind of stick together and do their own things. But there's nobody is going to the Georgia colony and then heading up to Maine.
Yeah.
That's just not really, that kind of travel back then wasn't, it just didn't make any sense. And there was no reason because each colony was kind of like their own little world that they could reach out for help from their neighbors. But people in Georgia were never thinking about what was going on in New York.
Yeah, exactly. So you have these loyalist governors who are essentially usually people over from Britain trying to get like a cush job. Like I get to go over and be the governor of like the Carolinas, like the king has appointed me. And I think these are royally appointed roles.
Yeah, gotta be.
So all of the people in the most key positions of power are people that are very closely tied with the crown. Judges, people that are making, I don't know if barristers or is that this thing, same thing.
I can think like probably Friends of Parliament.
Now,
Probably be a good reason to get you over there too.
Now, as far as like a military goes, you would essentially have England sending over troops, having troops stationed in the colonies for little skirmishes or because of things like the French actually also being within that same area over kind of by New Orleans, Missouri River. Go listen to Louisiana Purchase episode. It explains a lot about that.
Native Americans.
But if any conflicts were to arise, especially stuff with the Native Americans, it was mostly militias. And basically a militia is just a group of, it's a volunteer fire department is what it is. It's a bunch of guys that will agree to band together. There is some structure of command, so it's not like they're just going out there lawlessness. There's an agreed upon structure of command, probably usually somebody that had served within the British military that had some type of command experience and structure and rank. But these were the people called upon to actually fight if any type of conflicts arose. Basically, if there weren't enough British troops to handle it, they would also supplement their numbers with those militias, and they could tackle bigger issues.
And on the Native American side, too, we're not going to get deep into it, and it's not intentional. It's just this was a lot to take in. But as far as the Native American side goes, there are tribes that are kind of almost encircling them from the land side of it. And every tribe has their, I believe it's called a nation. There's Cherokee, Iroquois, all of the different branches that were over there that are tribes. But you have certain conflicts that happen where it's just one tribe, or it is a tribe that had spoken to the French and made a pact or made an agreement. Hey, do you guys want to go harass the colonies? Yes, okay. Keep them on their toes. Here's a little coin. We're going to keep force feeding you alcohol and give you as much of that as you want. That's probably not going to cause an addiction later on, for sure.
That won't be a generational issue.
Yeah, but it was basically whoever got to the Native Americans first. So as the French came down the Mississippi River and started making connections with all of these different tribes, those tribes would tend to be sometimes more friendly to the French. If the Brits made it over there first and they had better relations with the Brits, that Native American tribe would be more sympathetic to British causes.
Another thing completely glossed over in any type of American schooling, the location of where most of these Native American tribes were around this time. I feel like through teaching and portrayals and stuff like that, whenever you think of, American Indians, you always think of like the Midwest. You think of a more like drier, arid kind of like area like that.
Yeah.
What you don't think of is that these areas that were most inhabited by these tribes were places in like New York, Pennsylvania, the Ohio River Valley. They were that far east. And so that's why there's so much conflict with the, original colonists, because they fucking moved into their territory. It wasn't just like the Native Americans were like, hey, did you hear about the white people moving in 100 miles away? We should go try to like raid and steal their shit. It was like, oh no, like they pushed us out and we're now going to raid and steal their shit.
Yeah. As far as the Native Americans go, they're just like any palefaces. I mean, we have inter-country conflicts all the time. They were warring with each other for different things over there. So again, I don't support anything that we've done negatively to the Native Americans, but at the same time, to say that they were like, we just kind of came in and kicked their ass. They put up a fight for everything that we took from them. They were a very good adversary that we just had the benefit of smallpox and guns, basically, that they didn't have.
So this essentially kind of fast forwards us to a situation in the colonies in which there is just kind of it's not quite a war yet, but there's tensions brewing between the French, their Native American allies, and then the British colonists. And this essentially comes to a head during what's called the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War is part of the larger 7 Years' War. We've talked about it during a couple episodes, probably the Napoleon episode. But the 7 Years' War is essentially a war between France and England. As they have fought so many fucking wars before, they're always waiting to go at it. So this doesn't actually technically start over in Europe, however. There's a situation where I think that there were some French and Indian forces that were encroaching upon what the colonists had considered their territory. And so there was almost an exploratory expedition sent out by the British military, which it was at that time also consisted of people that had lived in the colonies as well. So what you would consider Americans. And I'm probably going to use colonists and Americans. When I say Americans, I just mean the people that were living in in the United States in the colonies at the time that this all kicked off.
Yeah.
So it'll be the Brits or the Americans.
Part of this whole skirmish that was going on was based in something called the Ohio Valley. The Ohio Valley, I believe, technically is now more in Pennsylvania, but it was referred to as that, I'm assuming probably because the Ohio River flows through it. And when you were claiming territory back then, we're talking about a time when you just wouldn't see somebody from France. There wouldn't be a whole lot of talk. So it would be one explorer that would go out there with what are they called, cartographers?
Yeah, surveyor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They would find an area, they would create a map. On that map, they would trace out everywhere that they explored and everything that was their territory. Now, you don't go consult with the colonists and say, yo, we looked at this area, this is ours, this is our map, don't step on this. So this Ohio Valley was a situation where France had claimed it and the British had claimed it. And the British colonies actually had eyes to go up there and start kind of surveying land and opening it up for any sort of farming or anything
The
like
manifest
that.
destiny ship.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Native Americans that are living there aren't really big fans of the French. They weren't really on their side. They like the British people more. So there was this idea that they would go try to meet up with the French. They would have a discussion. They would let them know, this is our land. You're not going to do this. Now, out of all the guys that we need to do an episode on, I feel like the most interesting is going to be this guy that we're about to talk about, George Washington.
Yes. Infinitely interesting.
Very, very, I mean, some people hail him as a superhero. I think we talked about it on a former, it's coming up, but people in Britain would consider George Washington a terrorist.
After the revolution, yes. Hero before.
So it's one of those things where there's good guys and bad guys, but most of these guys are just gray guys. And I think Washington's a pretty gray guy. He did some awesome stuff in our eyes. Didn't do some awesome stuff. Wasn't the greatest general, and we'll talk about that. But 21-year-old George Washington, who spent time
As a land surveyor, when he was like 16, he went out, and that's kind of why he got into the British military and why he was actually chosen for this specific mission. He was second in command, I think, of this mission.
He was,
and he'd been familiar with the area.
He started off as the leader of the one of the areas of the Virginia militias.
Yes.
And then he moved up into the British.
He was originally from Virginia. We're not going to go into his history prior to this. This is where we're picking up with George Washington. So we'll do an episode on him where we explain his backstory. But
he was 21 years old at the time. So he's a young man who doesn't really have a ton of military experience besides just kind of figuring out on his own and watching some other people, that's leading this expeditionary force that meets up with a Native American band that's up there, and they're heading up to talk to the French. Eventually, they make contact with the French. He gives the command of the king to get out of our area because we need this area. We had already surveyed it. And the French guy just laughs in his face. He goes, "Oh, I will tell my boss, but we are not going anywhere." Washington was like, "Cool. I just came here to give you the message. You know, what you guys do with the message is really on you. We don't want to fight you. It's us and this Native American tribe that lives here or lives close to here. If you guys don't want to comply, we'll just mess you up eventually." So they part ways. And Washington actually runs onto, was it an exploratory group of Frenchmen?
yeah, so basically, and it can be questionable. Basically, exploratory groups are just like performed by the military. There's not like the explorers and then the military. It's like if we need someone to go out and explore, we have a military for that.
An expedition.
Yeah, an expeditionary force, which is why the Brits probably still called it the British Expeditionary Force, like even in World War One. So, yeah, they come upon in this like little ravine, this group of French, and then also some of their Native American allies of the tribe that they were kind of working with. And they basically get into position, like an advantageous position, uphill or on the high ground. And they notice across the ravine is the group of Native Americans that they're working with. And it's kind of, the French end up waking up, someone alerts them, and there is, because accounts are always going to be from the perspective of who's providing the account, it's kind of, there's going to be a lot of this during the story. There's not a lot of concrete evidence on who fired first.
Yeah, because we have two massive nations that are pretty renowned for some of their history work telling their own sides of the story.
Yeah, where it's actually, they're keeping tallies of who has fired first. No one wants to have to add another one and be blamed for the the coming conflict. Well, this ends up devolving into the 7 Years' War. So, in a weird way, George Washington, who was actually part of this group, and at one point the commander had been shot and killed, right? He had to take over command of them, so he was actually the de facto commander of this group, started the conflict with the French that started in North America, the French and Indian War, which then turned into the 7 Years' War, which took place over in Europe. This was technically...
It took place on like 5 continents, didn't it?
Because they all had their colonies as well. They had like colonial interests like right next to each other.
You had friends and allies jumping in on both sides. There were definitely more countries involved.
a true world war.
Yes.
In a certain sense, but because it's just a war that is known against England and France, people, I guess, just didn't question it in Europe anymore when they're like, did you hear England and France are fighting again? They don't even ask deep questions like, oh, are they fighting in their colonies? It's just like, again, it's the same shit.
It is an even year. I'm sure they're fighting this time.
So this war is happening also within the colonies. You end up getting toward we'll end up doing another episode on the 7 Years' War,
sure.
but the short and skinny of it is that Britain ends up winning. And through that victory, we touched on it in the Louisiana Purchase episode, all of the French territory that France had claimed in the Americas was now, or in North America, was now being turned over to Britain, all of their land claims. They did go ahead and transfer, though, the Louisiana territory over to Spain. So Britain couldn't claim that. England couldn't claim that. So they basically kind of kicked out the people that they were just fighting with. They're not at war with the Native Americans, not at large scale like they were during this. And because this is the 7 Years' War, they're hurting in the pocketbook.
Well, another huge factor in this was Britain drew up an agreement with those Native American nations. I think it was something like they won't go past, where was it? It was like Missouri or something like that. They basically drew like an imaginary line and said, I promise we won't send any colonists past this line.
I think he was pretty close up to the Appalachia Mountains. Did I pronounce that correctly from the comment we got? Appalachia? I think I did.
Sounded good.
But yeah, I think that had they tried to go any further than that, they're like, we're only going to go to the Mississippi River. They're like, fuck, that's a long way.
Yeah. The big issue with this is the more skirmishes that you have with these Native American tribes, you want them to stay in place. That's a problem for another day. Mm-hmm. But you also want the colonies to stop harassing them for the land that they want, that we were just told that we won in this great war that we helped fight. And so the more skirmishes that happen, the more British army you have to keep in America to protect the colonies from the Native Americans.
And the reason that the French were so reliant on the Native Americans for this is at the time that this happens, you had like 2 million British people in the colonies, and you only had 60,000 French settlers. So they had to supplement their numbers in a major way with the Native American populace there.
Probably most of which were centered around New Orleans, too. So you're all the way in the bottom. You're not...
I mean, at the same time, because they still have those holdings up in Canada and everything, they kind of had a chance to recruit them from all over.
True.
So you end up getting the Treaty of Paris. There's a lot of treaties of Paris, apparently, because I searched this, and there's just one every like 15 years. The Treaty of Paris this time basically is the capitulation of France to England during the 7 Years' War. What comes out of this is you have people that fought in the militias or in the army during the 7 Years' War that aren't like soldiers that are just like, oh, well, the war's over, we're going back to England. You had a whole bunch of people staying here that had lived here, grown up, were here generationally, that now have this war experience.
Yeah.
So this is going to come into play huge when we start talking about the actual revolution itself. But there are people also known within the colonies that were war heroes, like George Washington.
Sort of.
Well, by the end, here's the thing. Because of the mishandling of that initial situation, he was not looked upon favorably in the beginning, because if you're going to start something that ends up devolving into a war, you're not going to be, people aren't going to like that. Well, but as the war went on, I think he started to actually kind of find his footing and his niche, and that's when he became more successful. So then by the end of the war, what he had done, after that fucking bungle, that's kind of what cemented his reputation.
Well, and his bungle was the massacre that happened when they got the high ground and jumped the French. The second deal was he had actually surrendered something called Fort Necessity. Mm-hmm. And he was taken, I guess you would say, prisoner, captive, and returned back to the colonies. But you could kind of look at that two ways. The people of the colonies, saw a guy that took over from second in command to control this unit and to successfully fight off the French at Fort Necessity for a very long time before they ended up having to give it up.
Yeah, like dwindling supplies. Yeah. Men were getting injured. There was like sickness, disease in the fort.
So people on the British side are like, well, shit, you lost, you gave up, you got taken over and you lost. But the people in the colonies are like, you persevered and made it through a lot. So in the British eyes, Washington's kind of a washed up, not a great guy, never really had a star. In the colonies, Washington is a star on the rise.
Yes, okay. That makes sense. So at this point, because war is fucking expensive, Britain is broke. And in order to start getting some of that money back, they look over at the colonies and they're like, you know what? We should probably start taxing these people on certain things. And we could, we did go over there. We sent troops over there. We did go ahead and fight in this war. We did end up winning, so these people weren't taken over by the French. They need to actually start paying for some of this war.
And we still have soldiers stationed over in America in the colonies.
We still have all of our administrative people, governors, things like that, that still have to be paid for. And because they're serving these colonists, then the colonists should pay for them.
I can't say that I disagree with that too much.
That's the thing, is it starts out with a very rational thought. The war itself, if you think about it, was started over in North America. I think George Washington had people made the connection being like, it started here, George Washington, taxes are starting to go up for these fucking things. People probably wouldn't have looked kindly upon George Washington if they realized the direct correlation for this, The
war that he maybe unintentionally started.
And here's the thing. It probably wouldn't have taken much to start this war, because literally it's just like England and France are just aimed at each other with the fingers on the trigger being like, huh?
Yeah, whoever farts first is getting shot. Along with this, trying to figure this stuff out, this is the part where I sort of diverge from the super American support, but at the same time almost gather an appreciation for the colonists. Because 1764, one of the first moves that they make is something called the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act was put in place where it wasn't necessarily a tax. It was a tariff that was 6 pence that was put on any non-British ship bringing in sugar, because you're in competition with the French sugar islands in the Caribbean and then your British sugar islands.
Yeah.
The Americans were just smuggling in sugar.
Yeah. Like the Dutch were huge about smuggling that shit in, right?
It was anything that the people in the colonies could get illegally. It was almost like they preferred to do it.
And here's the thing, too. It's not hard to smuggle stuff into the colonies because you don't have a huge standing army over there from Britain or a huge standing navy. You have some stuff for them to be able to go ahead, put down civil unrest, things like that. But all of your strength is kept over in Britain because the person you fight the most is literally across the English Channel. So you have to keep all your strength there. So, like, you would have to be a really bad smuggler to get caught.
Yeah, you would almost have to, like, walk up to them and say, this is smuggled sugar, sorry. But like you were talking about earlier, molasses is what was used to create the rum that was one of the cash cows. Not quite to the level of tobacco, but it was a very, very big deal.
So it was like rum north, tobacco south.
Yep. Along those lines, when this happens, the colonies kind of go nuts because the colonies had never really faced a tax. It was sort of like once they got over here, they started producing, obviously. Britain was selling things to the colonies that they needed, their goods and supplies, some of the commodities that they needed. But as far as that goes, there hadn't really ever been a concern about taxation. And when Chris was talking about how long it had been since they had been there, they're not used to having to pay these taxes in these situations. And not to say that that's not coming from Britain, because I think we talked about it in the lottery episode. In order to raise money in these colonies, they would do things like lotteries that were technically just a tax that they could get people to voluntarily pay with the hope of making an extra 50 pence or whatever off of that ticket.
There was also the fact that I want to say there was something in the British Constitution or whatever they call it, that the wording of it was that it was like gifts to the king. and gifts are a voluntary thing. So I think in a way that there was money being sent to Britain because they were also technically paying certain taxes on goods coming in that were going back, but these had been long-term established. So what they maybe weren't used to, maybe they were used to taxes, but because that had always been business as usual, they'd never run into a situation when all of a sudden all these other things were going to start being additionally taxed that they just had gotten used to not paying additional money on.
Yeah, and to put it into perspective, all of the taxes that were put in on the colonies, compared to like the British Isles, they were paying about a tenth of the amount of taxes that a British citizen would in Great Britain or Ireland or anything like that. So it's not necessarily that they were being taxed a ton because everywhere else in Great Britain paid way more in taxes. But it was just the fact that this is something new that they weren't used to.
Not only that, but it comes in, and we're going to use this term quite a bit. It comes into the fact that these decisions, when they come out with this like Sugar Act or whatever it was, the 1733 Sugar Act,
1733 and then 1764, so they renewed it.
They did not have a say in this. True, the people in Britain were paying more in taxes, but they were able to effect change through Parliament by elected officials. There was no one representing the 13 colonies in Parliament, so these decisions were being made without any of their consent. It was taxation without representation, is what the term is coined as.
And there were people over there, though, that did care about the colonies.
Yes, there were people because they had business interests in the colonies. Yeah. Maybe they had lived over there because you had American-born Brits that then moved back over to England and had just normal lives over there. You also did have people that were born in the colonies that were over there serving as like agents or ambassadors. Ben Franklin was over and lived in, prior to him having to leave England due to the war, he lived there for like 20 years, right?
He was a man about town pretty much everywhere he was. He loved France. He loved England.
He's one of those guys, I think, that he looked like 50 or 60 since he was like 30 years old.
Steve Martin type, for sure. Well, I mean, if his hairline fell quick and he always had that pot belly, a pot belly and a ponytail will age you visually.
And those boots.
Yeah.
So while you had him over there as like kind of an ambassador for the colonies, he had no power to actually do anything within Parliament. He could talk to people and advise people, but when it came to, at the end of the day, he actually has no say. So this big thing about no formal representation in Parliament comes up. You don't have the right to tax us if we don't have a right to be representative and have a say in this. Another act that comes out is, and this is one of the big catalysts for it, is called the Stamp Act. Now, this comes out in 1765.
We got one more before that. Okay. 1764 again, the Currency Act.
Oh, okay, that's right.
Currency Act was huge because
so many fucking acts.
Yeah,
Sister Act 2.
I don't think Whoopi was in the Currency Act, but Parliament had assumed control of colonial currency system, and they prohibited the use of any new bills or any reissue of existing currency. The issue with this was without much British money flowing into the colonies, any paper money that they had over there was going to have to be something that was made up. Because if you don't have that money flowing in, we don't have gold, we don't have silver over here. There's nothing to back this currency system.
You have to have some form of commerce. You have to have some type of monetary system.
A standard.
Yeah.
Just like we used to be on the gold standard. You have to have something to back up that bill physically. So there were situations over here where I didn't realize that this was real, but they were actually using like Native American wampum to pay for different things. They were assigning money to like shells, just all sorts of different kinds of currency that they could figure out how to make into that system.
Depending on which colony you were in, I guess you would have your own form of currency probably, or different exchange rates or like,
So this became a big deal for Great Britain because when they came over to sell things to the colonists, and the colonists were paying in wampum, and they're looking at it like, we can't pay our debtors in this.
Do you think what ended up happening is when they had to send additional troops over and like officers and people like that, administrators to, oversee troop movements and logistics and shit, that it was the first time that anyone had been over there to really look at stuff and been like, what are you guys fucking trading with here?
Yeah.
Like pelts and furs and like... like vegetables and everything. And they're like, yeah, I mean, everyone kind of uses their different thing.
And what do you want us to pay with? You guys didn't send us over with any money.
Yeah.
So this becomes an issue because, like I said, Great Britain can't pay off their debts that they had accrued defending this area with shells.
Yeah, if they're being paid in a money that has no value over in Europe, like what are they going to do?
Exactly. So they come through, and when they completely overhaul this system, that's a pretty overarching move. You overstep your boundary quite a bit when you completely disregard somebody's monetary system and then just tell them to figure it out again.
Yeah.
Like
figure it out in a way that you can pay us something of value that we find valuable.
Yeah. So I could see that hurting. And then what you're about to go into, the Stamp Act, is just kind of another continuation down this line.
It's so fucking petty. It's like they had to find out. They're like, okay, so I'll explain the Stamp Act. Stamp Act 1765. What it did is it required a special paper. It had an embossed stamp on it. You had to buy this paper if you wanted to be able to make recognized legal documents, newspapers, magazines, playing cards, any of this paper that you wanted to use to make any of these things and have them be like legitimate, especially like in newspapers and legal documents, you had to use this special paper, which cost more. So they're just trying to find all these fucking tiny little petty ways to fucking charge.
I don't want to jump on the British side here. But the Stamp Act was already a thing that was happening in Britain. And the Stamp Act only affected printers, lawyers, or anybody that needed legal documents. Now, there's always been financial...
classes, tiers.
Yeah, financial tiers. And if you own a printing press, if you're a lawyer, if you're signing legal documents, those aren't going to be your everyday citizens. Those are going to be the people maybe of more means that have more seashells in their seashell bank accounts.
Those are going to be people that have a voice in the community.
Yes.
And have pull and are able to sway people to do certain things.
So if you're working out on the farm and somebody runs out like, have you heard about the Stamp Act? Like, no, what does that entail? And he's like, well, I mean, the guy that prints the money or the guy that prints the magazine that we all enjoy reading, he's getting charged more for that paper. And the guy at the field's like, the fuck do I care about that? What does that do to me?
It's the exact opposite for how they tax now. If you make less money and you're in the lower socioeconomic class, you get taxed more.
Yeah.
And the people that have more money. So at this point now, it's just like, oh, no. We're not going to tax the people that have means or don't have means. We're going to tax the people that actually have the loudest voice.
Yeah.
And the most pull in their communities.
And unfortunately, that's a double-edged sword because those people will have the money to pay those taxes if you can get it out of them, which they don't get any out of the Tax Act. But at the same time, those are the people that can rabble-rouse, and those are the people that can talk to their indentured servants, lower-class people, slaves that work for them, and rally them behind their cause.
So you have people serving in the colonies whose their job is like stamp distribution. So they sent over this huge amount of stamps that were going to be protected and everything, and they were handed to British loyalist officials that are going to be serving in these roles, and these would be the people that basically would just stamp a bunch of fucking pages of paper when somebody needed something. That was their job. Well, it was going to be their job because people found out who these stamp officials were going to be, and in almost every single, if not every single situation within the colonies, these people were intimidated into resigning.
There was one of them, wasn't his name Aaron Oliver, that got his ass beat?
Oh, yeah.
And they basically, not only did they beat him up, there was something, I don't remember if this was a story because there were so many of them.
I have stories from like each state.
But like they tore apart his house, but
yes.
They didn't like tear it apart. They just like lightly tapped the boards off and then stacked all of the materials that they tore off the house.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to each
Okay.
or a couple of the different states because there's fucking crazy stories from a few of these colonies. One thing that they didn't foresee is with the Stamp Act in England was that it was going to actually piss off British merchants.
Yeah.
Because what's going to happen if somebody can't afford something is they're not going to buy it. And because they're not going to buy it, the people shipping it from Britain aren't selling anything. So those people are actually being hurt like a second degree on the Stamp Act because no one's buying the shit that they're spending a whole bunch of money to send over. So in Massachusetts, shit gets real fast. So Andrew Oliver is, I think, who you're talking
Okay.
about. So all these guys are. This guy's a stamp official. His house gets looted and wrecked, and he resigns. There were a lot of situations where they would walk around with like the effigies of like the scarecrow guys and everything, and like with a noose and like light them on fire. That was apparently a really popular way to protest back then. In the lieutenant governor, his name was Thomas Hutchinson. His mansion was wrecked, and to the tune of what would amount today to be $250,000. In Rhode Island, 2 stamp guys' homes are destroyed, and the Sons of Liberty are basically threatened to help the guys that beat the shit or that like destroy their homes, or the main guy that actually got caught for planning it. They were like, we're trying to distance ourselves away from like, we don't want to have the violent rhetoric and everything. We want to be like a legit, like the Sons of Liberty, if you're thinking about them, these guys aren't the fucking, what was the name of the group that you were talking about? The fucking Proud Boys and shit.
Yeah, they're not the A team.
No, they're no. So the Sons of Liberty are kind of a group that's within the middle. So they're not like extremists, people that are going out and like burning shit and like breaking windows and everything. They're usually pretty well educated people within that like probably merchant and like lawyer class and everything that have ideas on like how to change and that are proposing that maybe they take place in their local legislature where they're actually like proposing these additional freedoms and the rights of the colonists. So they don't really want to have a reputation of being like, yeah, we resort to violence because then that destroys our legitimacy.
Yeah, some of them, very famous entrepreneurs. Some of them turned beers into super beers. Some of them were named Samuel Adams that were the brother of John Adams.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
A cousin.
Was it a cousin?
Cousin
I
of
thought it
John
was a
Adams, I
brother.
believe.
Okay.
So the Sons of Liberty are actually threatened. Members of the Sons of Liberty, they're like, we don't want any part of this. We're not going to defend this guy. They're then threatened by a bunch of like extremists to actually help him because they had pull in order to help get this guy out. Switching over to New York, there was an attack on the governor's home. These people are fucking like attacking the governor.
Yeah.
And I realized that he's the highest person, the British person in their colony and everything, but that's fucking ballsy that you're going after the governor's mansion.
I will say something very interesting about that, though, is throughout this whole time, whenever we learned about the Revolutionary War, it was always King George was leading the British side of the revolution. King George still, after all of these taxes, was still their leader. He was still their natural born king. They didn't believe that any of the stuff that was going wrong was any of King George's responsibility. Everything was solely placed on Parliament.
He was the divine placed ruler
Yes.
there. And if there was any failure that was happening, it couldn't be happening on the person who was placed there by the will of God. It had to have been the people that are just normal parliamentary people, the snakes that have got to be screwing us over here. Yeah, it was never the king's fault. In Virginia, this guy named Archie McCall, he wasn't even a stamp guy. He was a pro stamp merchant. He gets tarred and feathered. Now, really thinking about this, you have hot tar poured all over your body. Then you get feathered. What the fuck do you do when that shit cools? Do you have to then try to get someplace where you can heat it up enough to get it off your body?
Probably it has to be like a hot water bath or something like that just to loosen it up, because once that constricts and dries, it's pulling against your skin.
Yeah. The Sons of Liberty, just to go into that a little bit more, basically they're also one of the first instances of an intercolonial organization. They're not just in New England. They're not just in the Virginia Chesapeake area. They're not just in the South. They have agents and people within the Sons of Liberty within all of these colonies. They were basically just there as kind of rights activists for the colonies and trying to kind of make themselves be heard. Now, the Stamp Act, it actually goes before Congress because we were allowed to have some type of Congress for representation from the colonies.
This was just Colonial Congress, though. It wasn't Continental Congress.
No, definitely. It was just Colonial Congress to go ahead and talk about the Stamp Act. This took place, I think, like in October 1765 and had 27 delegates from 9 different colonies. So a couple of the colonies actually didn't show up. One of the people that was at this should sound familiar. It was our buddy Robert Livingston, the true architect of the Louisiana Purchase. So he's actually there, and the purpose of this, delegation coming together is to draft a petition basically on the lack of the right of the crown and of parliament to tax them without their consent or representation. So it's basically just a gathering to be like, hey, we need to put down our writing, unified our grievances, and get them before the king.
Every area, too, kind of had their own thing. When Chris was talking about like New England, those are more Puritan style people, so their religion is going to be different. The people from Pennsylvania were mostly Quakers, so they don't.
Pennsylvania Dutch, is that what it?
I think that might be what they've turned into, but there's still Quakers around. Quakers are nonviolent people, and they kind of fell out of favor in England because they believed that God was real, but they didn't believe that you had to have any of the middlemen between God to speak to them.
Early America, populated by convicts and pacifists.
Yeah. Everybody kind of had their own religious takes on things. So we're still to the point now where they're not thinking about battle. They're thinking that this is going to be something where if they draft these concerns that they have and send them over to the king, that the king will then give them counsel and look at them and try to strike down parliament.
The king just must be not aware of this, because surely if the king was aware, he would not allow this to happen.
For sure.
To them, there's not even outside of maybe the Sons of Liberty, there's no thought of independence at this point. That comes so much later in this story. Right now, it's just trying to handle things as if they were in England. We need to put our grievances in front of the king, and because of his divine wisdom, he will make the right decision for us. Well, another decision that came down from Parliament was the one you like so much, was the 1965 Quartering Act.
1765.
Sorry. Yeah, Jesus. 1765 Quartering Act. Please tell me about that.
So the Quartering Act is something that somehow still, I guess maybe not somehow, because this is kind of where it comes from. The Quartering Act is still in our Constitution. It's still in the Bill of Rights. I think it's like the fourth or something, the Fourth Amendment, maybe, that says that you are not required to house and feed soldiers while they're...
It's the opposite Quartering Act. The anti-Quartering Act.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But quartering is essentially when you have soldiers come into your town or area, you are responsible for letting them live in your house or to pay for the barracks that they're to stay in. They can come into your house, they can stay in your house, they can eat your food. They can really kind of just have the run of the place, and you have to be cool with that.
So I feel like we're going to go back and forth on this, which I actually love. Here's where I can see the British perspective on it, because the Quartering Act, when looked at it from the perspective of us and when used in propaganda, when trying to rile up the public and everything, the Quartering Act was kind of painted just like that, where they can come into your house, they can do this, they can do that, they can take your property. Or what it was is they basically spelled out in the bill that would be a last resort, that they would try to use barns, all this kind of stuff beforehand, like inns, if they, hotels or inns that they had. And and way down on the list was like homes. So as a last resort, but even though the fact that that's in there, had they left the homes part out, they're like, okay, if they need to use like our auxiliary buildings or something, that's fine. But because they added that in, people focus on that, and they're like, well, what's to stop them from just doing that immediately before trying any of those other places?
Yeah, I also think that they took a perspective on it as, well, if they send 8,000 extra people to our little colony town, and they didn't have hotels, they didn't have like gyms at high schools that they could sleep in. Like there weren't rec centers that were big areas to put people.
Yeah.
So you had barns. I'm sure an inn was maybe like 10 rooms. At the same time, though, you still have to feed these people. Yeah. And if you have a finite amount of resources within that town, and then you have to bolster and feed those people, they're taking food out of your mouth.
Regardless of the severity of it, it's still being forced to do something that you feel that you should have a right not to do, bringing people forcibly into your home. If it even came to that, the fact that they're saying that they can do that is what causes the backlash.
Well, and I'm sure, too, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but when you're getting ready to attack somebody and make sure that you wipe them out and try to defeat them in war, don't you give them no quarter, like give them no place to rest?
Uh, I'm trying to think of what that means, like no quarter given. I think that has something to do with leaving them alive. I'm going to look that up while you go a little
Okay.
bit ahead. Yeah, Patrick Henry has his like kind of comeuppance, or not comeuppance. He has his kind of come up in 1765 as well, right?
Yeah, he's a young boy. Patrick Henry, the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" guy, decides in his spot in the Virginia Congress to refuse the implement.
No pity or mercy.
Okay,
So, yeah, a little bit different.
a little bit.
It would be kind of funny if like it did actually no quarter was like, we're not gonna let you stay in our house.
You got to sleep
We'll
outside.
put you in the ground.
Patrick Henry ends up passing these things called the Resolves on the Stamp Act in the Virginia Congress. He used established British law. I got a problem with this. Just getting out in front of it, stating that Virginia was subject to taxation only by an assembly of which Virginians were elected as their representatives. Sounds good. It sounds clear. My bugaboo with this is he's trying to use British law while trying to not follow other British laws. Like,
I mean, man's a wordsmith.
yeah, but we're kind of doing a backbend to get around acts because they weren't passed this way, but at the same time, you're not wanting to pay the taxes that everybody else in Great Britain has
So
to
you're
pay.
saying he's just like he can't double stamp a triple stamp.
Yeah.
So basically, you can't just be like, "Hey, we're gonna pass a law here," and then you're just gonna veto the law on your end. Like that's not what we're doing here, guy.
Well, and the other aspect of this that I also don't agree with is when he says something like taxation by only by an assembly of which Virginians are elected as their representatives. The way that Parliament is set up in England is there's only about like 10% of the population that gets to choose who goes into Parliament because you have a bunch of people that can't read.
Yeah, you have to be a landowner.
Yeah, exactly. You have to be a landowner. So there's all these stipulations to stop people from having their voice heard that still get taxed over in Great Britain.
The other thing too is if you think about that, the representation is then even less for the colonists because it's not even close to an accurate representation of people in the country in which it's representative of. You have no representation of anything.
So I feel like there's a little bit of maybe not understanding what goes on in England as far as like, because not everybody has their voice heard
I just
in
think
England.
they're sick of this shit. Here's the thing, they've also been it's not like these are people coming over from England knowing what it's like in England and then comparing it to how they're there. These are people born in the colonies and all they've ever known is the colonial, the American way of doing stuff.
Yeah, and you have 9 other colonies that joined this cause, so that would make 10. There were 3 other colonies, I believe it was the Carolinas and Georgia, which were newer colonies, so they were almost more used to the British way of life. And their leaders from Britain that were down there heard about them doing it, and their congresses are like, no, you guys aren't going to do that. You're what's considered British loyalists. You're the most loyal of the colonies to us, so you're not going to sign on board that.
Yeah.
So they just didn't do it.
Well,
Everybody wins here, right?
well, there's a couple of reasons for that. So in 65 cuz it's the repeal, right?
The repeal 66.
Yeah. So I want to say in July of 1765, the prime minister in England is replaced with another guy from like another political. It's the same thing that they used. What was it in when we're talking about Churchill, the Tories and the someone else, or they
The
have
Whigs
like 3
and
parties,
the Tories.
and they have like 3 parties: Labor Party, that
Whig
kind
Party,
of shit,
Tory Party, maybe.
something like that. So you have someone coming in that might be part of a different party and kind of use the colonies a little bit differently. Viewed also kind of all the unrest that was going on in America and also in England due to the Stamp Act, and because of that, we end up getting the 1766 declaratory?
Yep.
Declaratory Act.
And everybody thinks that this is fantastic because the number one thing that the colonists read was that the Stamp Act is repealed. So everybody's celebrating that. They're all pumped. They ended up scoring a moral victory and didn't have to pay 1 cent over there.
Yeah,
But
it didn't even have time to go into effect.
Yep. What they
Because they
did.
had fucking intimidated all. They had such a problem establishing people that would actually be the stamp guys because no one wanted the fucking job.
None of those guys had houses anymore, so how are they supposed to be effective? Something that was fairly overlooked, and maybe, again, another problem for a later day, is Parliament goes ahead and declared authority was the same in the Americas as it is in Britain, and asserted their authority to pass any binding laws on American colonies.
It was basically like handing them like a muffin and being like, there's a turd in it, but not telling them because they gave them what they wanted to get their attention. But then they're like, but just so you know, we do have the right to do whatever we want to do in the colonies. But everyone is probably so fixated on the fact that the Stamp Act got repealed that it feels like a win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
You won the battle, but they've just set you up to lose the war.
the next thing that we put into place will go into place. There will be no repeal on anything that we do next.
All right. Before we get into that, let's take a bathroom break.
Okay.
Oh my God, Adam. What is that up in the sky? It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's socials. Oh my God. It's faster than Instagram.
That's historically high pod on Instagram.
More powerful than X.
It's historically high, historically HI on X.
Able to leap tall threads in a single bound.
Back to historically high pod on Threads.
And, I mean, I guess there's still Gmail, right?
We got that too. That is historically high podcast at gmail.com.
All right, guys, back to the show.
After that nice break and maybe a little bit of smoke, I'm about to pop a Flint's Mints Strawberry Magic with an F strength of 225 in. This is going to wet me down.
I'm going to one up your ass. I'm going to go lemon with 250.
Oh, buddy.
I'm going to have a wetter mouth than you.
Enjoy that. The wetter, the better. Mm-hmm. So, we move on to the next next act.
The next act of fuckery.
It's about to be imposed in 1767, the Townshend Acts. It was a revenue act. It was imposed duties on imported goods, and this is just a bunch of them that came through these acts, such as glass, lead, paper they got back, paint, and then something that we just always keep coming back to in every English episode. I swear to God, it's always about tea.
Is it crazy that the Revolutionary War was also the death of tea in America and the rise of coffee?
Think?
Oh, yeah. People, when they were boycotting tea, coffee was the alternative. And once people got hooked on coffee and saw that it gave you a little bit more of a pep than tea, they didn't go back. It's the death of tea in America.
Do you think iced tea helped bring it back, though? Because they didn't
Completely
have
different.
ice back then.
Brits don't I don't think they fuck with iced tea.
Yeah,
I think
but
iced tea is like,
in America, I mean.
it's like Taco Bell calling Taco Bell Mexican food.
You don't
In America, yeah, tea, but look what we do to it. Like, what's the best kind of tea? It's loaded with
Green
fucking
tea.
Well, like, come on, let's be honest, like a syrup-heavy peach tea.
Oh, yeah. Still,
Or
I mean,
tea
or
and
liquid death
lemonade.
teas.
That's true.
They're clear, they're good.
That's true.
They're delicious.
Very, very good. They'd be better if they would sponsor us, but...
Yeah, just gotta throw us a bone. This act was used to replace all of the lost income that was never gotten out of the Stamp Act. A large part of the act reduced taxes on tea imported from the East India Company because in this situation, and this is going to be a whole nother episode, this episode is just like we're carpet bombing future episodes, and the East India Company will definitely be one.
This is like when we do theaters of war, and then we come back and pick things out of it that we need to get more specific on.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, I'm pretty sure you probably figured this out because we're an hour in and haven't even gotten to the war, the Revolutionary War.
I was going to fuck with them at the end, but...
It's
I was going to be like,
two-parter.
and then America fought, and then we won the war.
It's going to be a two-parter. But the East India Company, the British East India Company, was a big part of this whole puzzle because they were essentially one of those companies that was too big to fail. And once they fell on hard times and there was no money left in the British East India Company bank account, the English had to bail them out. So they had to not only continue to recoup money from this French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War, they're also bailing out this British East India Company that they had to because there were so many members in Parliament that had a stake in this company staying afloat.
The other thing, too, it's so weird how the fucking spider webs on this occur. The East India Company was basically ruling India for Britain, and because they had their own standing military that they paid for and had the interest of England in what they were doing, basically England was like, oh, fuck, it's free military down there. We don't have to send our military. We can keep it here for the colonies. Perfect. And so they had a huge vested interest in the East India Company, and so much so that they were basically like, hey, how about we make you guys the exclusive shippers of tea to the colonies? No one else will be bringing in tea. You guys will have that exclusive contract. So that'll bail you guys out and you'll be making all of that money.
Which leads to the rabble-rousers in Massachusetts.
Boston, you're a problem.
Yep.
I fucking love it.
The Boston Non-Importation Agreement, signed in 1768 by all Boston merchants and traders, was a form of protest against the Townshend Acts. No goods from Great Britain were to be imported except for any sort of necessities.
Mm-hmm.
So
So wait, so people didn't get their tea? Or were they getting that sweet, sweet smuggled tea?
They loved it. They loved smuggled tea.
They said people never stopped drinking. Like, there was no stoppage. It was just like walking. As soon as they weren't bringing stuff into the port, you had guys just standing back there being like, psst, psst, you want some of that tea? I got that Earl Grey shit.
I think their big mistake was they were trying to sell them on, like, India has the best tea and we're just going to bring it straight to you. Part of the other thing that was going on was, before this time, the British East India Company would bring the tea back to England, and they would have an auction basically to sell this tea to other traders, and then that tea would then come over to the States.
So they didn't
Or
have
to the
provi-
colonies.
Yeah, so they didn't have to provide as much of their own shipping. It was like hiring a subcontractor.
But at the same time, if you cut out the middleman's portion and you're collecting that, you're making enough money off of not having to sell it off.
That's true.
So this protest happens, and it leads to March 5th, 1770. We're going to start zoning in on some of these dates because they're a little bit more important.
Stuff had kind of, before you get to that, before that, tensions were already kind of high in Boston. So in 1768, while this whole kind of tea boycott is going on, the Brits actually seize like a free merchant vessel called the Liberty, ironically enough, called the Liberty, on suspicions of smuggling. Now, the reason that this is such a big deal is you're basically taking away someone's like right to just their privacy. You're seizing their property.
You're taking their liberty.
You're taking their liberty just based on a suspicion. There was a small riot that occurred because of that. Also, there was an 11-year-old boy that was actually killed by a customs employee. So tensions are high between essentially agents of His Majesty and the colonists that are living there. I'm sure there's other stuff going on with, little spats here and there about being, assholes and things. And it comes from both sides. Yeah. Honestly, Boston, again, I love you, but you guys can be assholes. There's a reason the term masshole exists.
Yeah, ask any African-American outfielder that's ever played in center field in Boston. They hear a lot of not great terms.
All right, so getting to the Boston, and I'm air quoting this, massacre, because, again, it's which perspective you're viewing this from. Because once we get to the numbers and actually explain what happened, it's gonna open it up a little bit more.
Well, and this is a situation where it's called the Boston Massacre here in the United States. Over there, it was called like the Boston Incident.
Yeah.
Which the words or the story here is vastly different. 300 to 400 citizens?
Yeah, so it's crazy to see that, like, you never hear, I mean, you do nowadays, but you never hear the word propaganda used in a negative way when you're talking about it with, like, the United States.
Yeah.
Because it's not called that. Propaganda has that term. There's got to be another term for it, but it's exactly what's occurring here.
It's propaganda.
Using
propaganda.
the term massacre is definite propaganda. I'm not saying that these people had the right to get shot and everything, but put yourself. Let's reverse the situation. So we are in England right now, and we have embassy of Boston, and there's a guard outside. Well, the guard starts getting harassed. Do something, lobster, whatever it is, or vice versa. And you get a crowd of roughly like 300 to 400 of these fucking yelling. I'm going to switch it back because I'm going to confuse myself. Bostonians,
Yes.
that are yelling at this British soldier, and he's basically just standing guard like outside the customs house. He's not patrolling or anything. He's literally just standing guard. It's like when you see one of those Buckingham Palace guards and you really just want to fuck with them, but these ones you could actually fuck with. And the guy's like, hey, please, disperse and everything. Well, because of the sound everyone is making, more guards end up coming out. The crowd is getting bigger at this point, and the crowd starts fucking hucking snowballs.
The American version.
Yes. Starts throwing snowballs. It turns into a snow fight. It's like Buddy the Elf. Well, along with the snowballs are chunks of ice. Then come rocks, seashells, anything fucking hard.
More of the British side.
More of the British side. So if we just want to meet in the middle and just say ice and rocks.
Snowballs.
Yeah.
Seashells.
Snow, just a whole bunch of shit. Well, you end up getting 9 soldiers coming out with the commanding officer, and soldiers end up pointing their rifles or pointing their muskets at this huge group of people that are basically throwing shit at them, yelling at them. Putting myself in their shoes, if you just flip the situation around, you're scared shitless as one of those 9 guys.
Yeah.
The commanding officer doesn't want to start shit. He seems like this guy knows like what the ramifications of this are. Walks out in front of his guys with his back to his guys' muskets and is like standing between them to try to keep his guys fucking cool and to try to like keep the crowd cool as well. Well, tensions are fucking high. One of the soldiers, as when you're fucking throwing shit, ends up getting struck in the head by like a rock. And these muskets, the way that, like, the information I learned about these, the way that they would have to, after a battle, discharge them because they couldn't keep them loaded because they could literally go off at a moment's notice. This guy gets struck with a rock, and they say as he goes down, he either pulls the trigger, which is a natural reaction if you're fucking blacking out a little bit from getting hit. The gun falls to the ground and goes off, but him and then another guy next to him end up firing into the crowd. The 2 shots go off. Everyone else fucking fires.
Yeah, I don't know. I find this one to be sort of tough both ways.
Mm-hmm. I'm not taking one side or the other. No. I'm saying I can simply see being put into this situation. Had this happen as if you're an American and we had an embassy over in another country and you saw a group of 300 or 400 people, we've seen footage like that. And who do you automatically say is going to be in the wrong at that point, even if they're just throwing shit? Like, come on.
Yeah, we don't have to go overseas in embassies. This stuff happens all the time.
Yeah.
Kent State Massacre, a future episode on that. There's a situation where when firearms are brought into a time of protest, everybody gets a little bit more on edge. Mm-hmm. Some people don't handle it well. Some people start to feel anger to the point of where they want to fight back.
They're yelling to shoot, too.
Yeah.
They're looking for a reason to get this fucking thing going. So they're like, shoot, you cowards. You don't have the nuts.
And by the same accord, if you do bring a weapon to something like that, you have to be smart enough to only use it in a situation where death is imminent.
Well, the shit talking back then was like, do it, you devils, you rascals, fire your shot.
Suck on my bollocks.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, not a great situation. They end up charging 9 of the soldiers, all 9 of the soldiers. John Adams is chosen to defend these British soldiers. John Adams, the man who goes on to sign the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, also the 2nd president of the United States?
I believe so. And the reason that these people are on trial is the result of the Boston Massacre, Boston Incident, whatever you want to call it, is 5 Boston citizens killed.
Yep.
Several other were injured, but just the main one is 5 people were killed. There's a relief that was made. And is a relief just like, I don't know what the difference between a relief and a painting or a drawing is.
Relief, I think, is etched in that way you can stamp it down and you get the negative of the etching.
Okay, that makes more sense. So there's a very famous, probably the most famous relief of the Boston Massacre that was actually created by a guy named Paul Revere. Now, this is why Paul Revere is probably this is because of the etching, I think, is why we know of Paul Revere. Even though we know him for the ride, the reason the ride was focused on him, we're going to get to it, is because he already had that, because he already seemed like a patriot, because he created that etching that basically had the red devils firing into the crowd of innocent people and like making them look like kids or like younger people and women, a bunch of women like in the crowd, like for the emphasis that they were firing into like women and children. Yeah, there were no rocks, there were no sticks, none of that shit was coming from the crowd.
Well, those are your guys. Why are you gonna put that in there?
No. I totally get it. I'm just saying the iron. There's so much fucking irony about how we look at things and how we look at other places that do the same type of shit.
Also hilarious when we get to what Paul Revere is known for.
Yes.
I mean, the fact that that's what he's known for, and this is his biggest achievement in truth, is pretty interesting.
But yeah, getting back to the John Adams thing, so he wasn't like a public defender or anything like that. He was actually just a lawyer in Boston. But because he believed that if the country was going to succeed, if the country was going to be able to govern or prove that it could govern itself, they couldn't lose the rule of law. And so he took on the job of representing the 9 soldiers that were, put on trial. He got 7 of them were found innocent, and then 2 were guilty, and I can't remember what their sentences were, but they weren't sentenced to death.
Oh, buddy, you don't know what their sentences were.
I can't remember. There was a lot of information.
This is incredible. Maybe this is the legal side that sticks out to me. They were found guilty of lesser charges, so it wasn't murder.
Manslaughter.
They were found guilty of manslaughter. Their punishment was a branding on the thumb.
That's right.
That was their punishment.
Okay, but do you know what that signified?
Yeah, it's like the mark of the whore. They put a stamp on you so you're marked for life, so whenever you're out in public, you can be seen.
You would get one petition from the church that you could use to ask for forgiveness, and the church could step in on your behalf to like provide that you're a good man and everything. You got one, and they branded you to let them know that if you fucked up again, you'd already used your one.
I went deep into this because I could not believe that was like an actual punishment. The first thing that they said was the biggest part of the punishment was the pain of being branded. People get branded for fun now. People, in lieu of tattoos, people will get branded.
You were like given an actual get out of jail free card.
Well, and also at some points in time during medieval times, they would brand you with a certain brand. So as you walked around town, everybody saw the crime that you had committed.
Pirates of the Caribbean was actually accurate with the P brand to brand someone as a pirate.
That is what Sparrow had, huh?
Yep.
So this is a situation where all they got out of was they gave away their do not pass go, do not collect $200 free pass from the church, but they had to be branded on their thumb, which just sounds terrible.
You used your freebie.
Yeah, you killed 5 people. We're just going to brand you on the thumb. After that, we run into something called the Gaspee Affair in 1772. There was a boat called the Gaspee that was outside of Rhode Island. It was enforcing something called the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were to try to stop smugglers and to try to keep them from bringing things in. The Gaspee was actually chasing a boat that it suspected of smuggling, and it ran aground in Rhode Island. And when it ran aground in Rhode Island, some of the Sons of Liberty heard about this. A gentleman named Abraham Whipple, sweet last name, don't see a lot of Whipples still out there. And another gentleman, John Brown, not the John Brown from the Rebellion. I looked into it, not the same guy. He had a pretty politically related family, I want to say. They were both the leaders of these guys that ended up going down and meeting the Gaspee as it ran aground. They single-filed onto the ship. They went ahead and tied everybody up, threw them off the ship, and then they burned the ship to the waterline. So now you have these guys taking it into their own hands to go out and punish a British schooner that was protecting the area from.
Wait, so the Gaspee was chasing another ship that they suspected of smuggling.
Yep.
The ship that ran aground was the Gatsby.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I thought you said that the ship they were chasing ran aground. I'm like, why are they burning their own buddy's ship? Okay,
No,
I
no.
totally
That guy
get it
got
now.
away probably because it was a smaller ship than the schooner.
Gotcha.
So as soon as the Gaspee runs
Oh.
aground, they can't get to
Yeah,
it.
because of the, what do they call that? Oh my God. Like how high or low it rides in the water.
The hull?
No. There's a term for it. It's draft. Yeah, shallow draft.
Okay. So yeah, once that happens, it's a sitting target. And the Sons of Liberty decide to go out and exact a little bit of revenge on this ship. They don't kill anybody.
Yeah.
They beat some guys up, but they burn this British holding to the waterline. Pretty big deal. May 10th, we have, of 1773, we have the new Tea Act that goes into effect that creates duty-free shipping on any of the British East India Company tea. This blew me away. 86% of the tea that was drank in the colonies was smuggled in. It wasn't British tea.
Yeah.
So 14% of the tea drank in the British colonies.
They were losing money just for having they were losing more money by having this fucking tax or tariff than they would have just if they didn't have it. They would keep, like, because people would keep just getting the tea the way they've always gotten it.
Yeah.
And they would be selling it more in bulk. So
They undercut the smuggling price by making it duty free, and then they had the Navigation Acts to try to cut down on the smuggling, but still it was 86%. All of the other colonies, besides one, ended up repelling these ships and stopping them from pulling into their harbor. Unfortunately, the one that got into the harbor was back in Massachusetts.
yes. There was a partial repeal of the Townsend Acts. Again, they're pissing off a lot of people and they're making a lot of noise about it. So they're like, okay, we'll go ahead and repeal. And they repealed most of it, but they didn't repeal the part on tea. So they basically took the thing that they would be making the most money off of, the people bought the most, and they were like, we're just going to go and keep this one.
Yeah.
So again, we're giving you this victory here, and then we're putting our thumb up your ass over in this direction.
Unfortunately, that ship made it into Massachusetts.
December 1773. Roughly 30 to 130 men. Some of them dressed as Mohawk Indians.
Most of them dressed as
Most of
Mohawk
them,
Indians.
other ones with dirt or coal smeared on their faces, decide to walk out to Boston Harbor with a crowd following them. They go out to the ship that happened to make it in, walked on board, kindly asked the gentlemen that were currently stationed on the ship if they would like to go ahead and get off the ship. If they didn't get off the ship, they were helped to get off the ship again, non-violence. The only injury that occurred during the night in which they dumped, I believe it was 92,000 pounds.
342 chests. 42,000 kilos of tea.
Almost 100,000 pounds of tea, which when people talk about the Boston Tea Party just casually, they don't mention the amount of technical property destruction.
Yeah.
It's meant to seem like a lighthearted, symbolic, like, look at these rascals dumping this tea into the harbor.
The thing about it, too, is they had so much time. Because when that boat landed into harbor, they had 3 weeks. They had 20 days, so essentially 3 weeks, to figure out what to do with it. And at the end of those 3 weeks, the payment was forced, and the British merchant was then on the hook for the tea.
So I think kind of how it went down. British merchant comes in. He's going to offload the tea to get it purchased. He's being stopped from offloading the tea.
Yep.
So he's not getting any money to be able to pay the amount that he's supposed to be able to bring it in, whatever the money was, because no one's buying it from him. So it has to sit there until these portage, docking fee, I don't know what you would call customs fees, is basically what they were.
Yeah.
The Brits were keeping the ship impounded there for this time period until
colonists.
21 days had
Colonists
passed.
were keeping it impounded, right?
Well, the colonists were keeping it technically impounded by not providing any money for him to then pay the customs fee.
Yeah.
So by result, yeah. So it gets to the point where after 21 days, the Brits can actually seize the tea. And in order to prove a point, they waited all the way up until the 20th night and then decided to do this. The amount that it would equate to in today's money would be $1.7 million worth of tea was dumped out that night.
Well, the funny thing about it is it wasn't like they just tore the boat apart. Like, they were requesting if there were keys to locked doors so as to not break the locks
Not only
off.
that, they were asking, like, is there anything? We're only here to take just this cargo and destroy it. The captain was like, okay, I have this other stuff. Like, this is my personal stuff and this is other stuff. They were like, oh, cool, we'll just leave that stuff alone. Can you just, like, walk us around and point it out? He's like, can you show us how the pulley system works? They were literally, like, using winches and pulling it up on the deck, and then guys were dumping it out over they had like a fucking assembly line system for all this tea going into the harbor.
It blows me away that it was that, like, formal of a job. It only took them 3 hours.
Well, when you have like maybe 130 guys
Yeah.
doing this, that's quite
Sell 92,000 pounds of tea in
Yeah.
3 hours. That's a hell of a lot of time.
Well, and none of them were actually caught because none of the witnesses, which there were a ton of them that were watching this, no one's going to turn these guys in. These guys are heroes. The British fort that they had within Boston, which all the soldiers were at, or any soldier a group large enough to respond to this, I think they actually saw this happening, or one of the commanding officers did, and he's just like, yep, not dealing with this tonight. What am I going to do? They're going to be gone by the time I get over there.
Is there a non-zero chance that at any point in time the British were like, you see who did that? Did it look like Native Americans to you? Do you want to go question any Native American tribes about this, or do we all kind of know who probably did this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there wasn't any. The disguises were not good. So September 5th. So this happens, Boston Tea Party. What was the date on that?
December 16th.
December 16th.
1773.
Okay. So
everything goes really, really bad for Boston once this happens. The British response is nasty.
They basically are like, you're going to pay for the fucking tea. You're going to pay every shilling or whatever they were charging at that time. And then basically they were like, you're no longer you're placed under martial law, right?
Yep.
So they sent over a shit ton of like British regulars, and the town was put under martial law.
We're disqualifying your guys' Congress. So you will not be in any sort of power. We are suspending the use of your Boston Harbor, which is the lifeblood of Massachusetts, because it was the only place any of this stuff was coming in. So we're going
But the Crown can still use it.
Yep.
You just can't use it for your own personal or merchant use.
It's all under our control now. So that's a huge blow. Again, losing your government when you've been complaining about no taxation without representation. Now you don't have any representation even in your own colony because the British have assumed power over it. So these were two blows where it's like, ooh, we might have gone a touch too far with this, because not only do we have to repay all the tea that we ruined, we don't have control of anything around here anymore.
We're not making enough money to repay this tea.
Yeah.
And who's going to repay it? Like, the city didn't do it. It was it's an impossible situation.
We didn't charge anybody with this, so who can we charge for the tea?
So this actually goes on for a little while. Do you have anything before we get to the First Continental Congress?
No.
Okay.
No, because that was everything that was introduced was technically referred to. They introduced the Boston Port Act, which closed down the port, the Massachusetts Government Act, which closed down the government, the Administration of Justice, which was the fine. All of these things were looped under something that the colonies referred to as the Intolerable Acts.
That's right.
The Intolerable Acts need an answer.
Yeah. So September 5th, 1774, we're jumping forward almost a little under a year. We come to the First Continental Congress. Now, during this 9-month period that this has happened, basically having a Continental Congress, this is something that shouldn't really be allowed, and that the King of England and Parliament would be very unhappy if they knew that this was happening.
This is my favorite part of the story.
So they end up getting together. I think when it first started, was it all 13
12 of the 13.
12 of the 13
Again,
were
I think it
represented.
was no Georgia.
Okay, gotcha. So the Congress is basically there because everyone's got the same fucking gripe about the taxes, but now you also have this example of Boston, which, looking at it from the outside, when you hear the reports of what happened, that a group of individuals dumped tea into the harbor, and until they pay back everything, the entire city's on lockdown. That fucking scares the shit out of every other city in the colonies because that seems like an insane overreaction to something that was the actions of individuals. So everyone is getting together and like, okay, we need to figure this shit out before this gets worse. And we're all sitting like Boston is sitting right now.
Yeah, well, we could be in this exact same position. So, First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. Probably my favorite part of this whole story is this was George Washington's first ever trip to Philadelphia. And there's a little bit of...
The planter from Virginia.
there's a little bit of like, I don't know, a myth that these guys, and later on down the line, they all spend a lot of time together. But the First Continental Congress was like the first time that a lot of these dudes had met. It was the first time that Washington had met Jefferson.
Most of them.
Or, yeah, maybe not Jefferson, because I think Jefferson was Virginia too.
There was no room to step outside your own legislature and be your own delegates for this. And also, all of these colonies had to be on the same page to say, hey, we're sending you like 2 or 3 guys that are acting on the behalf of the entire colony, but shut the fuck up about it because no one can know that we're meeting to discuss this stuff.
But think about in history, like the first time that Washington actually meets Adams.
Yeah.
Because Adams is up in Boston. He was the lawyer for these British soldiers. George Washington...
Still insanely respected, though. He ends up becoming the president. That is how much he put in to the, the movement of independence, is that no one really knows that he was the lawyer that represented you. No one hears that about John Adams.
Well, they'll hear rumbling. Like, everybody in the colonies knew who George Washington was.
If you ask someone who John Adams is, how many people are going to have that in their top 5 facts about John Adams?
I mean, nobody that wasn't in the elite of the colonies.
But it's a huge thing to represent what everybody was saying. Don't do this. It'll completely tank your career. No one will look at you the same.
And to think that this was like the first time all of the founding fathers linked up and had a drink together.
Yeah. and some of these guys that are here, there is a second Continental Congress when shit gets even dicier. Some of the guys are different. It's not always the same guys, but you do have some of like the key players that are attending this.
I think Franklin's there, Jefferson's there, Madison is there. I don't think Hancock is at this first one. Obviously, Washington is there. When they all meet up together, they construct a Declaration of Rights, the Continental Association. They send the petition to King George, and they do something called the Non-Importation Agreement.
Is it all together the Suffolk Resolves?
I believe so, yeah. So all of these things fall into place as we're getting together. We want to make a declaration of all of the rights we believe that we are given based upon what the British citizenship is given. So they're not creating anything new. They're just trying to declare the rights that they believe that they have that should be protected. This Continental Association, to go along with that, is not a full-blown Congress of everybody from the colonies, but sort of an understanding that there will be communications between the colonies, that we will support each other.
It's like we have a loose association, a mutually beneficial deal to protect one another.
They also had this ability, as any British citizen did, to petition the king. So they wanted to send the king their grievances because, again, at this point, and I can't stress this enough because it's so shocking to me, we weren't looking at revolution at this point in time. We were still looking to the great human deity of King George to come through and fix our problems. We didn't want war. We didn't want independence.
We were avoiding it at all costs.
Yeah.
It's the last thing that anybody wanted, and so they're just going through any and every avenue just to try to like explain how like serious this is and how many people this is affecting.
And then finally, the non-importation agreement was them all agreeing that any orders that they had placed with Great Britain were allowed into the colonies. Anything after that in the following year would be no importation of any sort of British goods.
It was a mass boycott.
Yeah.
It was an agreed upon boycott across the board for the colonies.
You have 12 of 13 colonies that have signed on to this.
Yeah, so thinking about that from how it's going to impact everything going on over in London, if one colony boycotts your goods, won't you just go to the next colony, you bring it in there, and then it finds its way back into that colony over the land.
Yeah.
If you have nowhere to bring anything in, you're fucking shit out of luck.
We run into right after that, believe this was 1775, March 23rd, that fiery Patrick Henry.
At the Continental Congress, right?
This was afterwards.
Okay.
Patrick Henry stands up. I don't think he is the governor of Virginia. He goes on to be the governor of Virginia, but he is a member of their Congress. Stands in front of Congress and he gives the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech.
And that's just the Virginia Congress.
Yes.
Everyone has heard that "Give me liberty or give me death." That wasn't even in front of like the Continental Congress. It was an impassioned speech. It was essentially just a remark how someone had like challenged him about like what his value of liberty is or something like that, like how far he would go for it. And that was just simply his response. But you have these like quotes and these words that people say that are known in our lexicon so well today when they were almost just an offhanded comment on a Tuesday.
And some of them weren't even real. Some of them are just adaptations of like what they thought Thomas Jefferson would have said at this time. They're misassociated with some of these people. This one's spot on. Patrick Henry definitely did say this one, but it's used as you say, in today's times for so many different elements of somebody who wants to fight back against the government. I mean, Patrick Henry was saying this. He wasn't saying "give me liberty" or "give me death" because he wanted to go to war. Yes. He was saying it because
it's so important to me.
Yeah, he wanted to scare almost the British into be like, "Oh, okay, you get your liberty back."
Yeah.
Like, there was no even thought of what was going on as far as in these guys' minds. Now, everything outside of this becomes questionable because there are British soldiers that are in Boston at that point in time. They are keeping an eye on everything that's going on inside the city. They're making sure that Congress and everything isn't meeting. I'm sure they had heard about the Continental Congress.
There was a ban on any type of groups as well.
Yeah.
Like that weren't expressly like, you had to petition the king in order to form any type of like group.
Mm-hmm. One thing they do get wind of, though, is there may be a militia buildup of gunpowder, of weapons, and of lead shot for bullets. Revolutionary bullets, balls.
So you constantly have essentially, British sending out, listening for information. There's spy networks back as far as this goes. And so there's also spy networks that like the Sons of Liberty and these patriot groups have that are keeping track of British troop movements and knowing where they're at and, where they're going. So, yeah, some word finds its way back to command, whoever is, I can't remember who exactly was leading there in Boston, but basically they're like, at this farm, there was a guy who was he was actually in the British military, but he'd retired or left the military, but they're like, yeah, they're storing militia, like a buildup of arms. I hear they have a couple cannons on this guy's farm. We need to go ahead and nip this in the ass and quickly, because we don't know when they could potentially rise up. No one's fucking happy in Boston right now.
No. So when all this goes down, they decide that the British troops, there were about 700 of them, go ahead and take a little trip up to a couple places called Lexington and Concord, where they were in New Hampshire.
Well, no, Boston,
Pennsylvania?
No, it was in because they were one of them was
Lexington, Massachusetts,
15 miles from Boston, and then Concord was 5 miles past that.
Okay, so Massachusetts still.
Yeah, so they were led by the 700 British regulars, were led by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. So yeah, they were basically on a clandestine information or mission to seize these weapons in Concord. Well, because of the spy network in Boston that the Americans, I'm just going to say that from now on, that the Americans had, they'd actually been tipped off about this mission. They had a spy communication network. They were able to go ahead and get word and basically let the person know whose farm they were hiding this stuff at in advance, and he was able to relocate it, bury a bunch of it like in a field.
His sons did, yeah.
Yeah, his sons were able to bury a bunch of the stuff in the field. So they knew that these troops were actually getting ready to move. Not only that, but because these people were coming to take their arms, essentially their means of defending themselves in case anything were to happen, anything tyrannical, the militia started to mobilize.
Militia's mobilized. There was I believe this is when it happens, an agreement made that if there is a movement towards Lexington and Concord, maybe this was between Lexington and Concord that this happens, the one if by sea, two if by land, or one if by land, two if by sea.
Okay,
Was that between Lexington and Concord, or was that on the way up?
No. So what happened was, and again, the story gets bumped up for storytelling purposes. So we have Paul Revere, Samuel Prescott, and then a couple other guys, and basically they're watching these troop movements. It takes a lot to it's going to stand out when you're trying to marshal and march 700 men out of Boston. Yeah. Now, Boston right now, at this point, it encompasses a lot larger area than it did back then. The city of Boston was just on the main area that's out in the middle of like Boston Harbor, like that little spit of land that's connected by a very narrow strip of land. So you either have to move all of your soldiers past that point where it's very easy for someone to watch that, or you would have to take all of your troops across in ferries or boats over to the other bank. Basically, the reason you would do that is because you had to exit Boston to the south. The areas that they're going to are actually more to the northwest of where Boston's at, so it would take them longer. So they may take a boat across. The reason we get the one if by land, two if by sea, Paul Revere, Samuel Prescott, and a host of other people all ride out in different directions because some of them may get caught. It's nighttime. If you get caught riding at breakneck speed and you run into a British patrol, they're going to be like, the fuck are you doing? They know there's some type of rebel activity going on in this area.
Were they actually called Paul Revere and the Raiders back then?
Probably not.
No.
I don't think so.
The other guys that with him weren't the Raiders?
No.
Just the band eventually?
I didn't get that reference until you made the band comment. So the one if by land, two if by sea, Paul already starts writing out to let them know of the troop movements. They're going to get around in front of them, basically at the nearest point where they can still see Boston, but then they can ride quickly to Concord or Lexington and Concord, and they're watching this old church steeple. They were going to wait till the troops moved out of Boston. If they started to take the ferries over and move all the troops over to the other bank, it would be two by sea. If
two candles?
Two lanterns.
Lanterns.
And if they were coming down that little spit of land that connected it, it would be one. They're coming by land. It would let them know how much time they have and let them know who to alert and where they'd be traveling. Paul Revere actually gets caught. He meets up with someone else that's riding out to do like the notifications, raise the alarm. The British are coming, all that bullshit. And ends up running into another guy. They run into a third guy that's all within the same group, and then run into a patrol of British soldiers who are like, what are you guys doing out at night? They know something suspicious is going on. There's a group of 3 of these guys riding at breakneck speed, looking like they're trying to avoid the authorities.
A lot of questions.
Yeah, a lot of questions. There's a little bit of a skirmish, shots not fired or anything like that, but 2 of them actually end up escaping. Paul ends up not escaping. And as they are like dragging him off his horse and putting him tying his hands together, all of a sudden you start to hear these town bells ringing. And all of a sudden the British troops are looking up. He's like, you hear that? He's like, they know you're coming. And so they start to actually get a little nervous, and they take Revere with them for a little bit, but they end up just releasing Revere because they don't want to have to be responsible about maintaining or having him yell that they're coming and all that kind of stuff. They can't do anything to him because they haven't been proven that he's out there doing anything nefarious.
Yeah. The bell ringing is pretty ominous. It feels like there could be something going on.
So as they roll into Lexington, they have to go through Lexington in order to get to Concord. The militia that's been gathered there to kind of confront them is basically just a group of old men and young boys. This isn't the cream of the crop militia. I can't remember, they were off maybe doing something else or stationed somewhere else, but this was definitely not the A team that we're dealing with here.
I believe they were known as the Minutemen. Just again, a collection of militia that was in this area of Lexington and Concord that got together to protect their areas, because we don't have a standing army. There's no way to meet the threat of redcoats coming in to try to find this cache of weapons and powder.
Well, there had been a group that had assembled at Lexington because, again, it's like a 15-mile march from Boston to Lexington, and Paul Revere had made it to Lexington in order to go ahead and tell them. I think he ended up getting captured like on the way back to try to get, or to Concord or something like that. But there was a larger group of these guys that had gotten together, but after waiting for hours, and they, the adrenaline starts to wear off a little bit. You're not sure if they're still marching the whole distance at night, or if they've already bypassed you somehow. So they started to lose guys, but a group of them went and hung out in the tavern, and then finally started hearing the drums, like the fucking snare drum that started alerting them that they were marching. And so a group of, I don't know, how many was it?
I don't have the exact amount for the Minutemen.
It was small.
It was a smaller force than the 700 redcoats
I want to say
showed up.
30, 40?
I think it was more than that. I think it was like 200 or 300.
Okay.
Just based upon the deaths that are coming soonish.
So you get the group, you get British soldiers coming in. Again, it's not like the whole wide line of all 700. You basically have them marching in columns of probably like as wide as the road will allow, 6 men across, something like that. So you get that first group that comes out and maybe spreads a little bit, but you're essentially, and was it called Lexington Greens?
Yes.
They called a grassy area kind of in the
battlefield.
central of town. It was the battle. It was Lexington Greens. So you have these two opposing forces standing across from each other, everyone being armed, and there's just this standoff. The colonists know why they're there. Now the British know that the colonists know why they're there. So there's that added element that if they're standing there in front of us, they're determined not to let us proceed.
Well, and there's a belief among both sides that this isn't going to be a battle. This is going to be some sort of discussion that they have to go one way or the other. The Minutemen didn't show up to fight.
No.
And the Redcoats didn't show up to fight.
No.
But when you're faced against each other on an open pitch, and there's that feeling in the air that there could be something going on.
The tension is just palpable.
Yeah, you can cut it with a knife.
And you get this, the commander finally gets up to the front riding his horse, and he's this, like, portly, like, older, like, posh British fucking guy in a powdered wig, and is basically yelling at these people to get out of the way. They're stopping the king's business, disperse immediately. Well, where the idea within the militiamen is, no, like you're looking to seize property that isn't yours off of just the, you're trying to take our arms away, our opportunity to defend ourselves. We know what you're doing here.
You want to search private property.
Yeah.
That's against the law.
Yeah. So it becomes a standoff. Now you have people that are literally at this point aiming guns at one another.
And then everything changes.
Eventually, and there again, it's accounts from people that are going to go one way or the other. There's no one bias at this location at Lexington Greens. There's no one bias here, and so as the Americans tell it, it was of course the British that fired first. As the British say or tell it, it was the rebels that fired first. But someone eventually fires, and then as soon as that happens, a second person fires. Then someone yells, "Fire, damn you," and everybody fires, including the militiamen. And this is what's known as the shot heard around the world. This is officially when this goes from a tense moment, a tense type of societal conflict, to basically an act of not even rebellion, because they don't see themselves as rebelling against the crown. They see themselves as
protecting their rights.
Yeah, protecting their own rights that were supposedly given to them by the crown.
Yeah. And as that shot fires and the smoke clears, that is part one of our American Revolution. Again, it's just a massive topic. There are so many other things that we're going to as far as the Revolutionary War. But just to lay out the injustices that kind of both sides saw going on at the same time, I can't really say one way or the other. And granted, I'm not saying that I would have rather stayed under British rule. I'm not saying that I want a king. That's not what it is. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I do believe that the way we were taught as children was this was something that there just wasn't a choice, that this was predestined to happen.
It almost feels like the way the story is told, it's told to us that they attacked us.
Yep.
And they could mean, and they never really specified that they financially attacked us or they attacked our rights of representation. It's that we were attacked and we had to defend ourselves, and through that defense, we gained our independence from the unjust, tyrannical, King of England.
And when in truth, we just gave you 2 hours of information that was probably condensed from 6 hours of information that we took in at least.
Yeah.
Just on this one subject alone. And at no point in time till the last minute of this story, of this 2-ish hour episode, we finally hear a shot ring out in war.
Yes. A situation in which two armed groups with the intention of fighting if it comes to it, not wanting to, of course, but doing that, we now have the fuse has been lit. And at this point, there's no unlighting that bitch. So we will catch you next week on the continuation of the American Revolutionary War.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.